So what's your opinion on land rights?
Well, I think land rights is an important issue for all Australians, and obviously particular for Aboriginal Australians. We never had land rights due to the idea of terra nullius. Now, terra nullius was what it's not right to call them settlers in those days because they brought prisoners out here. It was the authorities of those times called this land, and it allowed them to justify what they did to Aboriginal people in taking their lands. The interesting thing about the authorities of those times is they were actually told not to do that, not to take Aboriginal lands. But from a long history of being an empire, people could not get out of that idea. And they used terra nullius as a way to justify, but it was a religious thing. And it was actually an edict by the Pope. And if you'd like to look this up on your Google, look for Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery was proclaimed in a papal bull. A papal bull is an order given by the Pope, the leader of the religious world in those times. And that's what it's called, papal bull. We might have colloquial terms today that could belittle the little bull of it. But it actually fits quite well. What the Pope did in those times, he was named Pope Nicholas VI, I think, or the 5th. And it happened with successive popes as well. He actually declared to all of the monarchs in Europe and in England that they should go out and discover new lands. And it didn't matter if the lands were inhabited. If they actually had people in them who weren't Christians, well, they were free to enslave them. If they didn't like to be enslaved, they could be killed. And that was justified. And they invented the word terra nullius. In fact, I get it mixed up. Sometimes I call it nullius and other times it's nullius. But it simply means that it's not owned by anybody. No one lives there. Of course, this was not true. Aboriginal people were there, but they had been taken over by a culture who had used terra nullius around the world. And that culture had been around since the 15th century and probably before. So for hundreds of years, that culture had been applied. So as to see Aboriginal people, it was easy for them to totally discount that they were owners of their own land. And it was only in 1993, more than 200 years after white people first came to Australia in 1788, to colonise it. It was only in 1993 when Eddie Barbeau stood up and fought the courts for years, and finally it took him out, he died, before the decision was made. The island from which he came from, they'd actually pegged out land, and that land was his heritage. The Australian government finally decided to recognise that truth that people had lived on that land since time immemorial, and that they owned it. And that Terra Nullius was just a lie. Another victory that was a predecessor for this was when Gough Whitlam, I think it was around the 1970s, the mid-1970s, he actually handed back land to Vincent Lingiari and his people. What had happened to their land is that white settlers, and the man came from England, came out here, he got that land given to him. He basically enslaved the people that were on the land. Later on he paid them a small salary, but they worked for nothing except for the foods in the beginning. And they treated them like servants. And we've seen from many stories that come out from England how servants were treated. They were treated as low life. They were living on their own land and never left it. They finally wouldn't work for that man. It was called the Wave Hill Walk-Off. And then they took it to court. And Vincent Lingiari, fortunately for him, he lived to see the day when the Prime Minister of Australia came out and symbolically picked up sand from the earth that they were standing from, and he poured it into Vincent Lingiari's hand. He did it in a way that didn't need a piece of paper, but it's been recognised in both the white way and the native way. He gave back the land to Vincent Lingiari and his people. Today, I never thought that I would be fighting for my land, for my heritage. And in February next year, I will be taking another group to court, fighting for my ancestors' land. Native title in Victoria doesn't give you much, but it does recognise your history. And what has happened is another group has taken our ancestors so they can claim our land. And that is illegal. Culturally, it's illegal. You can't do it. We want to have that proven and shown in court and get our land and our native title rights back for our family. So that was never on my radar for retirement. You asked me about what I might be doing in 10 years. I hope I'm not doing that in 10 years. I hope it just simply makes sense. And something that it's not the truth. That they listen to our voice and give us truth and justice, and we get that land back.
Beautiful.